Hey, everybody, and welcome to the very first, the inaugural, the initial webcast from Distribution Strategy Group. You can find us on the web at distributionstrategy.com. I'll be your co-host today. My name is Bein and Heller, and I'd like to bring in my co-host, my dear friend, and the doctor of distribution, Jonathan Bein, PhD. Hello, Jonathan. How are you today?
I'm well, Ian. You know what PhD stands for, don't you?
No, what does it stand for?
Piled higher and deeper.
Ah, I got it. Well, you know, the irony is you call me Dr. Heller, but you're actually the doctor here.
Indeed.
So, all right, so today's topic is after the crisis, what distributors must do next. So before we jump in, I just want to say that for all of us here at Distribution Strategy Group, our thoughts are with the many people who have lost loved ones, or they're suffering from COVID-19, or they've lost their job as a result of the crisis, or they're suffering from the isolation. You know, our hearts go out to you, and hopefully this will be over soon. Now, whenever it ends, the distribution industry is going to be a lot different. I call it the new abnormal. We're not going to go back to the way it was before. So what we wanted to do today was give you our insights based on talking to a lot of distribution people and being in the industry for a long time. Feel free to ask us a question. We'll try to get to them as they come up. We have a lot of people registered and in the call, so let's jump into the material. Here's the agenda. We're going to talk about the rise of virtual work in a few different ways. We're going to talk about the effect of the crisis on digital channels that's going to last after the crisis. We're talking about the acceleration of B2B marketplaces, the new role for services, and what's really a technology imperative as demonstrated by the performance of distributors who are technologically advanced in this crisis. Jonathan, you want to take this one?
Absolutely. So I think by virtue of us all being here on this Zoom call, we are living some of the key points that are referenced here in this slide. The whole world is several 100% more digital than it was eight weeks ago. And that's true whether it's the consumer world, the business world, the educational world. On a personal level, I've actually taught 4 relatives and friends who are 70 plus to use things like Zoom. So what's happening in the consumer world is also happening in the business-to-business world. Some of the specific things that we're seeing are people are working from home now. As this call is taking place, where most of us are sitting in a home office. And to do that, we've reconfigured things a little bit. We've re-swizzled. We've got a home office configuration. If we didn't have a laptop before, if we were working on a desktop at a corporate setting, we might have a laptop now because we need to be a little bit more mobile. We've also got other things in our mix. CRM is not a big thing in distribution, but it's growing. Some of us might now be coordinating our field sales and customer-facing activities with our colleagues in the rest of our distribution business through a CRM system. Many of us are actually working from multiple monitors. I know Ian, my dear colleague, gets confused sometimes because he's got not only dual monitors, he's got triple monitors, and he has to monitor his monitors. He has to switch between them in skillful ways. There may be different connectivity using Bluetooth headset or speaker. I actually take piano lessons, and I have to configure my Bluetooth headset so that the feedback from the microphone, from the speaker doesn't go into the microphone and create a bad experience for the listener on the other end. So we're all doing new things with connectivity. And then finally, Zoom has become a verb, right? It's reached the level of to Google something or to Xerox something or to, I guess we don't say to Kleenex something, but we talk about Kleenex as a noun when we want to talk about tissue paper. So this whole thing that's happening with several 100% more digital in a very real sense is a crisis that's accelerating change that was happening anyway. As part of Real Results Marketing, which is becoming Distribution Strategy Group, we made a prediction in 2018 that this year, 2020, was going to be a tipping point for e-commerce, and that's based on doing an annual State of Distributor E-commerce survey. Wow, we didn't know how much it was going to tip this year. So So I think what's happening is that it's accelerating what was already happening was expected to happen in 2020 anyhow, where there's more of a shift to digital. And what we're seeing also is that there's kind of a winner-take-all phenomenon within this. Ian, do we have the other slides, Jason?
Yeah, I got them, but the next one is the one you inserted that I just tipped off everyone to, so.
Okay, so let's do that. So Jason, can you cue the laugh track, please? Like if this were a 60s sitcom. So video conferencing, we might all remember the tagline that AT&T had back in the day. It was long distance, the next best thing to being there. And now we're at a point where it's really a case of video conferencing, the next best thing to being there. Ian, which one is you and which one's me? I won't take offense to whatever you say.
I'm the audio only. I mean, even when that's me dressed up, actually.
Okay, got it. So Ian thinks he's the audio only. I think the truth is somewhere in the middle. I think we're all kind of sorting out our inner audio only versus inner with video selves. But the thing is that what's happening is an informalization of society. We are now becoming far less formal. You are in my home now. I am in your home with this video thing. How much more personal does it get than that? This really came home to me when I was working. I was talking to a supplier of ours from Dun & Bradstreet, and my first encounter with him was not good in terms of the outcome. I didn't get the price I wanted, and I sort of pegged him as being a certain way. And lo and behold, we get on a video conference, and mano a mano, face to face, I'm seeing that his closets are the same as my closets. And this whole personalization thing happened. So I think this is a really powerful phenomenon of what's happening now, is that the borders or the boundaries are coming down between people as we become more informalized. One of the things that we just did a quick survey recently to see how e-commerce is being changed as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. And we heard some anecdotes from some of our distributor colleagues and friends. We have one client that's in the personal protection equipment space. They saw a 400% spike in a 1 month period over the prior month. So clearly that is due in large part to the fact that they're selling personal protection equipment. Think N95s, think gloves, think respirators, et cetera. But also from other people we had heard that they're starting to see more revenue coming through e-commerce. So what this slide shows is, about half of the respondents said we're seeing at least a moderate shift or perhaps a major shift towards e-commerce.
Yeah, I don't know, Jonathan. I mean, when I look at this slide, to me, it looks like, it's kind of split. It's the haves and the have-nots, right? So you've got people who are seeing more sales through e-commerce and others that are not. My guess is if we could go back and assess the technology capabilities of these different distribution companies, we'd find that the ones who are seeing more sales had already invested in those tools, and they're picking up share from the people on the bottom who probably didn't have those tools. I mean, it's not a great story for distribution in some ways, because the people who have seen no change are about the same as the people who have seen moderate or major change.
Fair enough, but I would say that if half or more have seen moderate or major change, that's already a lot. Yeah. And I think if we look at it in the context of what we know to be true, what we know to be true is that we're several 100% more digital than we were. Yeah. Right. So I think there's different ways to interpret this. When I look at the anecdotal data that I have, when I look at what I see consumers doing, seems to me that this is supporting what we know to be true. And I think you had pointed out that a lot of a trend that we're going to see is that procurement people, purchasing people who maybe weren't as digitally oriented, some portion of them have gotten over the hump, right?
Yeah. Yeah, we have a question that just came in, Jonathan. And so I'd like your view on this first. Does most of what is happening for traditional distribution apply to the small manufacturers that supply them?
Well, I think there's a sort of broad answer to that, and then there's a more narrow answer to that. I think if we look at this in the realm of e-commerce, which is how I'm going to interpret it, it probably does apply to them. We're starting to see more of a shift of manufacturers going direct with e-commerce. Also, manufacturers are creating B2B connectivity between them and their distributors. So I think it is going to flow upstream as well if we interpret this in the realm of e-commerce.
Yeah, I got to tell you, I agree with you. I think, if you look at because this person, who's a great friend of ours, by the way, asked about traditional distribution. And I think, yeah, I mean, if you sell primarily to traditional distributors and they're not particularly digital compared to other channels, then you're probably seeing the same effects in terms of, being penalized in terms of potentially losing share. And I think, it's incumbent upon you to find distributors who are more digital, because these behaviors are not going to go all the way back to normal. I mean, how many people have never bought online or didn't regularly buy online who have become proficient at it in the crisis because they had to?
100%.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, and if we think about, we'll come to John's question in just a moment. When we think about the skill sets that are shifting or evolving as a result of the catalyzation from coronavirus, obviously there's the meeting virtually, making virtual sales calls, which has really profound implications for a field sales force, right? We've actually been engaged on the consulting side of our business to help a couple of different distributors apply some of the principles of proactive inside sales to help field sales reps who are at a disadvantage relative to normally how they interact, right? They have the benefit of face-to-face, of building rapport in person, pressing flesh. I guess that's more of a politician term, but I guess salespeople do that as well.
Sure.
So all of those advantages that field sales have are out the window. For existing customers, that may be a workable scenario, right? If you've already built a relationship, in other words, you're shifting the medium through which the relationship now operates. But for prospecting, it's really putting field sales reps at a severe disadvantage. And there's a level of some of them just don't know what to do right now in this new world. Hence the application of some of the practices of proactive inside sales.
Yeah, one of the points on here that I want to comment on is this notion of intertwined work and personal life. Because the first time I ever worked at home was back in, 2002 or 2003. And I read this book by Alan Weiss called Getting Started in Consulting. And one of the things he blew up was this notion that you should set aside a hard work day set of hours. So, you tell your spouse and kids from 8 to 5, I'm not reachable. It's like I'm at the office, which is what I tried to do at first. And then in the evening, I will be home just as if I was coming home from the office. And he said, that's a terrible way to work at home because it makes you sort of artificially parse out these hours. And he said, you're much better off going to your daughter's dance recital on a Wednesday morning and then writing that column on a Saturday afternoon when you feel like it, and just learning to switch between work and personal lives efficiently rather than trying to maintain this hard schedule. And I tried that. It worked so much better. So I felt like that was really helpful. Now, John's question, which is really more of an observation, is when normal supply chains get interrupted, buyers need to turn to the internet to find suppliers rather than their regular suppliers. I'm convinced that this is what's behind the e-commerce shift. And yes, that benefits those with better capabilities. And I think he's exactly right. I think what's happened is, people can't buy from the regular suppliers, at least not as easily as they used to be able to. And so they're Googling for alternative sources, and that's benefiting the people who come up first on Google, have good SEO strategies, have, great search on their site, broad product selection, and easy checkout. So it's just it's like this whole redirection of demand into these digital players.
Yeah, and it's more of this winner take most or winner take all phenomena that we had predicted a couple of years ago. So when you have a player in a sector who's got 20 or 30% of their revenue coming through e-commerce, and then they've got stuff coming through EDI, and they've got other stuff coming through order automation, they're going to start to take share. When you get to 20% e-commerce revenue, you're actually taking share from your competitors. So I think this is part of that winner take most phenomenon. The other thing to think about for those of you who are in different stages of the digital journey of creating some kind of online offering, you don't necessarily have to have a transactional capability. If you start with a great site of content, really good content, so people can shop, buy, evaluate, assess products, that may be a reasonable first goal if you're just getting going. Obviously, if you can get the transactional component, great. But I think it's also important to realize that many of your customers are now going to be shopping online, whether they are buying online or not. Right? So they might be shopping and then calling the CSR or faxing. They're certainly not going into the branch to buy online. But there is this distinction between shopping and buying, and we're going to be seeing more of both of those things in this COVID crisis and beyond.
Yeah, you've made that observation for a long time, Jonathan. I think it's entirely valid. I also think that the expectations continue to increase, and so the merit or the value of providing a shopping experience but not a buying experience is deteriorating over time, and you're going to have to plug in that buying experience at some point. But you're right that in order to get there, along the way, you need to create all the product data and shopping capability. So you might as well start with that.
Absolutely. So, welcome to the new abnormal. This is, I've used the analogy, Ian and I have used the analogy, we're stretching the rubber band during COVID, but it's not going to stretch back to normal. It's not going to stretch back to where it was. So welcome to the new abnormal, remote working. We're definitely going to see more online training versus in person. So if that's part of your value prop or part of your value-added services that you provide to your customers, you're going to need to adapt those services to be delivered through an online medium. And then finally, just as we said, the whole dynamics around buying and selling online are changing significantly. How we form relationships is going to change. Right?
Yeah, I think the other thing that came out of this is, there are account managers who are very technically savvy. I mean, we stereotype distribution account managers as older and not very technically savvy, but that's an unfair generalization in many cases. And when I've either worked or consulted for distributors, one of my favorite things to do was to go and make sales calls, and I still do that when I can. It's just a blast. I love it. And so some of those people still keep in touch with me, and it's interesting because one of the things I've heard from several of them is they've never been busier, in part because distributors are taking resources out of the branches, they're right sizing or, furloughing or whatever, but they're typically not doing that with the sales force. And so what's happening is a lot of the work, like, writing orders and looking up products, is now falling into the into the laps of the account managers. And so they're actually doing more work, not less. And I've had several of them tell me they've never been busier. Some of them are still selling like crazy too. And for the most part, what I'm hearing is that, hey, good thing we established those relationships up front, because it's made it easy for us to transition to this more digital selling environment. And of course, this is not just about distributors selling, it's also about manufacturers who have to manage relationships with distributors. So, the distributor as a buyer. And I think that's a little easier because most of those were, product managers who were in offices all day or most of the day anyway. So it's a little different than an account manager. But, these relationships are going to remain more virtual going forward just because people have learned how to make it work. It's kind of like, the notion of working from home used to carry with it this, almost not a stigma, but this sense that it was an unprofessional environment or it was too relaxed. Now if you're on a conference call and a little kid interrupts or the dog howls or, the doorbell goes off, people just expect it. And so that's become sort of this new normal, that it's okay now to have a different environment at home than in an office. At least it's more okay than it was before all this happened.
Is this sort of a build-up to your cat might walk in the room any minute?
Well, that's my dog. He's going to howl, man. He's loud.
Ow. But I also want to go back to another point.
Okay. Oops.
This
Sorry.
assumption that field sales reps have hair color or hair quantity similar to yours and mine, did I hear that correctly? Did you have that bias? Are you carrying that?
I'm accusing other people of that awful prejudice. It's definitely not coming from me.
Okay, good.
So, we look at who's gaining share during the pandemic, and we're going to look at some numbers in a minute. But, you guys everyone on the call has probably heard, this is the stuff that you need on a robust website. But if you actually go out and look at distributor websites, most of them don't have everything here, and I'm not going to read them off. But, a couple things that I wanted to point out is you've got to have integration into e-procurement systems. That's the second bullet point on the left from the bottom. And on the right, you need full integration into your ERP so that you've got availability showing and also customer specific pricing. Those are not cheap things to provide, but the reality is all the big companies are expecting the one on the left, the procurement systems, and pretty much everyone is not going to use a website if the pricing isn't right. I mean, I've seen this over and over with distributors where the e-commerce channel is the most expensive way to buy from them, and they wonder why their e-commerce channel is not working. Well, look, you're going to have to make your e-commerce channel priced right for the customer, and it can't look like it's way overpriced because you're just putting some catalog or suggested MSRP in there. You've got to make that e-commerce channel competitive. I mean, people aren't dumb. If they see that buying online costs me more money, they're not going to buy online. Or worse, people don't put pricing on everything. They'll say, well, we're going to price 80% of our SKUs. Well, someone only has to start building a shopping cart once and then get to an item that says call for price, and they're never going to try to build a shopping cart on your website again. So, I mean, just think about it as a consumer. If you went to a retailer and you went to the effort of picking out some items, putting them in a cart, and you got to an item that said call for price, you'd say, the heck with this. I'll either buy somewhere else or I'll call this retailer, but I'm not going to come back to this website. And so there's just this sort of unrealistic burden or set of requirements that distributors put on their e-commerce channel. And sometimes that's a technical limitation where they just haven't spent the money to do the integration, or it's particularly hard. Sometimes it's just a fear that we might anger our sales channel. But I would say in every case, it's a problem that's got to be solved if you ever want to be successful online.
Joe DeMarco had a great question related to your point, Ian. The question is, any suggestions on a tool to add in to an e-commerce site to check pricing and manage pricing? My experience, and I may be a little bit out of date on this, but my experience is that there are an increasing number of tools to get pricing intelligence, but they don't tend to live in an e-commerce platform itself per se. And that's one of the amazing things about this era that we live in, is that pricing intelligence has a completely new flavor to it, right? I've worked with a company that is one of the largest mystery shopping companies in the U.S., if not the world. They've got 350,000 mystery shoppers. In the old way of doing things, they would go physically into stores and check prices of competitors, as well as the stores of the company that the company owned. But now there are internet tools that can gather pricing intelligence as an input to the whole pricing process. Ian, are you aware of something that actually sits in an e-commerce platform?
Well, I think some of the pricing software companies claim to do this, but I think I'd have to understand a little bit more about the requirements. So what I would say is reach out to us afterwards, and we'll help you find a tool if there is one that's out there. Because I am aware of people who claim it, but I haven't actually used them, so I hate to recommend anybody. But give us a call or drop us a note, or we'll reach out to you, and we'll see what we can do in terms of finding a tool that really does do that. And I'd like to understand the requirements in a little bit more depth. Okay, so these are some interesting e-commerce numbers. So I just went and looked at four, really well-run, highly regarded distributors to see how first quarter of 2020 sales compared to first quarter of 2019 sales. I ignored margin. There's some margin problems out there. I'm just kind of looking at share. So I looked at Applied Industrial first. In the first quarter, it's actually their third fiscal quarter, but it's January through March of 2019. their sales grew 7%. So they had good growth last year, but they gave a lot of that back this year. Now they're in a line of work, they're in a business model that does not lend itself as easily to e-commerce as some others. So I'm not criticizing them at all. It just illustrates that, you know, if you're not particularly digital, it may have hurt you a little bit, not because you did anything wrong, but just because no one in the world anticipated that we'd be in this kind of pandemic. If you look at Wesco, they were down a little bit last year, up a little bit this year, so they're roughly flat. And I would say they're pretty digital. They've invested a lot of money to have some good digital capabilities. Grainger was up 1.2% last year, and they were up 7% this year. But I think they said they're down in the first 10 days of April. But they did pick up some share in the first quarter, it looks like. But check this out. So this was Amazon last year. So last year they grew 17% off of a $50 billion base. And then this year, they grew 26.5% off of a $60 billion base. And so if you look at like the 2-year first quarter growth here, so, you know, how they did versus the quarter, you know, cumulatively over the last 2 years of first quarters, you see Applied is roughly flat, Wesco's slightly down, Grainger is up, and Amazon grew almost 50% off a $51 billion base in 2 years. So, I mean, the reality is these marketplaces are growing at extraordinary rates. It's not just Amazon. You know, Amazon obviously is a lot more than just a marketplace. They're in all kinds of lines of business. AWS is growing at a ferocious rate. We think Amazon Business is, but they don't have to disclose it yet because it's not 10% of their revenues or profits, so we don't really know. But, you know, the word is that Amazon Business is outgrowing Amazon Retail. You know, one of these days we'll find out when it gets big enough. But I think some lessons here, looking at the results from some of these companies are, you know, in my opinion, I've been saying this for a while now, marketplaces are replacing company-specific websites for simple transactions. So, you know, if this is true, if you're going to see more and more commerce go to marketplaces rather than individual company-specific websites, then that means that while you need to be able to execute those orders on your website, in a lot of ways, your website's going to really be for the more complex stuff and for services, because the simple stuff is going to go elsewhere. At least that's the trend right now. The pandemic has obviously accelerated this change. I mean, you're seeing unbelievable growth for companies like Amazon and others through their e-commerce. You know, Walmart's e-commerce is way up as a percentage of its sales. And so, you know, distributors really need to understand what's going on with these marketplaces to, you know, formulate good strategy. And manufacturers are probably going to see margin pressure for a couple of reasons. First of all, you've got a whole new layer in the channel, right? It used to be, to oversimplify, manufacturer, distributor, business customer. Now you've got manufacturer, distributor, marketplace, and business customer. So you've got some additional price pressure in there because you've got someone else who wants to take a layer of margin and adds a layer of cost. Plus, you're gonna, you know, if these marketplaces are successful and distributors don't respond aggressively and appropriately, there could be some consolidation in the distribution channels. And anytime you consolidate demand, it drives margin pressure up to the manufacturers. I mean, think about what happened in the hardware channels when Home Depot came along, right? That's not good for manufacturers' margins because you have this, you know, 800-pound gorilla who's consolidating so much of the purchasing. So, you know, really in 2020, strategy without marketplaces is like being in 1995 doing strategy without e-commerce, right? I mean, if it was 1995 and you were developing a strategic plan for a distributor and you weren't accounting for e-commerce or e-procurement or email even, then your strategy would have been outdated as you wrote it. And I would say today, you know, looking at all these marketplaces out there, and you know, it's not just Amazon Business, it's eBay Business and Industrial, and it's Alibaba, and it's Walmart.com that's selling a lot of stuff through distributor or from distributors, it's I'm leaving somebody out, but anyway, there's a bunch of people out there who are building these B2B marketplace. Oh, Google Shopping. Google Shopping is another one. Google is now competing with Amazon you can buy stuff right on Google now. And they have to do that for various reasons that we won't get into here. But you know, these are you know, basically when Walmart and Google and Amazon and Alibaba enter your industry, it's not a good thing for the incumbents. And incumbents are going to need to respond because things are changing rapidly, and people have to take that into account as they do their strategic plan. All right, so let's see. I think we have another question. Let's see here. Let's see. Oh, it's from Joe again. Don't necessarily know we need that. Let's see. Okay, I think.
We're good.
Okay, yeah, he's good. He's good. He's going to contact Dean Mueller, who's on our team. Good. Okay. So the implications for distributors, I believe, are first of all, you need to be ready to sell through marketplaces. And by the way, the fact that marketplaces are getting a lot of the simple transactions, that does not ease the pressure on you to have a great set of digital capabilities. In fact, it increases the pressure because marketplaces are going to expect you to have product images and detailed product data and standard units of measure and the ability to match your taxonomy to theirs. But for the most part, those transactions are going to be things that have a standardized unit of measure. You know, a lot of times it's something that's shrink wrapped and sitting on a shelf, or it's a box on a shelf. They can be delivered by a common carrier, and there's really no labor involved in the order for the marketplace. Marketplaces hate labor. You know, a lot of times if you go to a conference, a speaker will ask the question, how many of you are Amazon Prime customers? And everybody raises their hand, right? Because everyone's got, in the professional world, has an Amazon Prime account. I ask a different question. I ask the audience, how many of you have ever phoned Amazon to place an order? Well, nobody raises their hand because you can't do that because marketplaces don't want to involve people in delivering the value. They want to just have the distributor use their resources to do the picking and the packing and the shipping and their working capital for the inventory and their capital for the forklift in the warehouse. They don't want to have any variable costs associated with the sales that are coming through their platform. So, you know, if it's your Amazon business or any of these other marketplaces, you know, you can add 50,000 SKUs from a distributor and your variable costs really don't go up at all. There's a one-time cost to build those SKUs into your system. And after that, you just get commissions and everything that comes through your platform. So you're constantly scaling your profitability off of a fixed cost base. And that's a huge advantage for these marketplaces. But it's also really helpful to know that strategically because, you know, if you know that these marketplaces are probably not going to offer as part of their value proposition things that take human intervention, people handling the order, then that's a lot of white space that you can build your own business in, right? So if they're just going to do the simple transactions, then that means on your website, you know, which you in many cases are going to have to build from scratch, you can do configurable products and SKUs that need technical advice, and you can do services of all kinds. I mean, services are essential, I think, as differentiators in the future for distributors, just because these marketplaces are so unlikely to provide them. And we put together an inventory of like, you know, 250 services, and we just kind of threw it together. It wasn't hard to find them. They're all on the web. So this is just a smattering of them. But I ask distributors all the time, are you taking credit for the services that you offer today? In other words, do you have a services tab at the top of your website? And on that services tab, do you have a bunch of rich information that describes exactly the services that you offer and how it benefits the customer? And by the way, why not go through all of your competitors' websites and list all their services and figure out which ones might work for you by going to customers and asking them and start building out your service menu. You know, you don't need to start from scratch. You don't have to invent new to the world stuff. Just do an inventory of all the services that are out there amongst your competitors and take it to your team and say, hey, look, you know, we've got this inventory of 150 different services. Let's prioritize them A, B, and C between us. Let's take the A's out to our customers and ask them if they would, you know, buy them from us if we had them. And then I think you've got to try to make services a profit center. And if you don't, then how real and how valuable and how much rigor are you putting into your services? I mean, if you're not charging for them, if you're not getting paid, then you're probably not doing a P&L. You don't know what the costs are. You know, there's no return. And I'm not saying you can charge for every service, but the default should be, hey, services should be a profit center. When I was at NAW in January, I sat next to a young man who was the new director of services for a good-sized distributor. And I was astonished. I'd never actually met one in distribution. I mean, I'm sure they're out there, but I hadn't met one. And he came from a manufacturing background, and he'd been hired by this distributor to make services a P&L. And the fact that he came from manufacturing is important because manufacturers are used to product development cycles, and they've got stage gate processes, and they know how to develop them and test them, and do the R&D around them, and make them national as they, or even international as they prove to work. And so he's bringing that. Yeah.
Yeah, so I think there's a lot in the services thing. And just by the way, as a preview of next week, we're going to be drilling down more into the services space. Sure. But I think there's a couple things here that are important. One is you mentioned about taking credit for services. It's also about communicating the value of services.
Yes.
So Joe DeMarco, who asked a question earlier today, has done a great job of taking credit for services that they deliver, even if there's not a dollar exchange in remuneration for that service. They communicate the value in the transaction and everything they do. We'll be discussing more about value communication of services. The second thing is that if we look at this list of services, part of the new abnormal is going to mean that you actually may be using digital to deliver the service, not merely to communicate the service or to advertise the service. Some of your services may undergo a transformation that now need to be provisioned, procured, and actually even delivered digitally. Not all of them will lend themselves to that, but we are in big transformation and disruption of services.
Yeah, and the other thing I'd say, I agree with you, and we'll put off most of that discussion, so thanks for pulling me off my rant. I think the other thing is that when it comes to understanding your exposure to marketplaces, I think that's not hard to do. I think that what you do is you get a group of your people together who really understands your business and who understand these marketplaces, and all of them, not just Amazon or Amazon Business, and take 300 transactions or 500 transactions at random out of the previous quarter and stack them up on the desk and make two piles. And this pile is, boy, we could have lost that order to a marketplace pretty easily. We didn't really add value to it. And this pile is, you know what, we probably would have kept that order even if that customer had an account with one of those marketplaces, because we added value, whether it's a specified product or it's reserved inventory, or we offered special technical support or some kind of assembly or kitting or vending or bin replenishment. There's something that we did that would have kept that order even if that customer had a marketplace account. And you're going to have two piles, and I think you count the transactions and you add the sales dollars, and that ratio is your exposure to marketplaces. And I think as helpful as it will be to have a number that you track consistently over time, there's even more value from having that conversation with your team, because what's going to come out of that conversation is a set of strategies about how we make this pile bigger and this pile smaller, so that over time we're reducing our exposure to marketplaces. All right, so there's a technology imperative coming. We think the requirements for technological expertise and technological competencies in distribution are increasing in several different ways. And Jonathan, since you've got the PhD in computer science, I'd encourage you to jump in wherever you want. I think, first of all, you have to learn how to sell complex products. So you need an ERP that is capable of attaching some module that allows you to configure products and maybe set up kits, etc. You need to build omni-channel relationships. So, you need to have tools that allow your sales reps to interact digitally with your customers, whether this is a voice-activated AI assistant, for example. And then there are, you need, hopefully we'll still have branches when all this is over. I think they still have a role to play in many situations, particularly in some industries. But you need to be able to offer multiple channels in many cases, but they all have to be equally competent. And I think that's where the e-commerce channel often falls down.
Well, and I think if you look at that omni-channel piece, on the one hand, there are the channels, whether it's e-commerce or whether it's marketplace or proactive inside sales, whatever the channel is. But then there's also what do you need internally to support the relationship aspect of things. So CRM is just table stakes in that. You've got to have a decent CRM. But then there's all kinds of other information that you need to be having on your customers about who they are, but also about the narrative and the dialogue that you've had with them, about what they're likely to buy next. There's a lot that goes on the inside-facing part of the business in building these omni-channel relationships and making the flow-through smooth and seamless.
Yeah, it's a good point, because it's interesting that distributors have such an extraordinary amount of data. I mean, you go to a retailer, you get a receipt, right? You go to a distributor, and they've got 50 fields on an order form, and yet a lot of distributors aren't leveraging that information. So you and I have been talking for years about, well, hey, if a customer buys an air compressor, how come you're not either in the moment or next day sending offers for air compressor hose and air tools and all the many, air compressor oil, all the accessories. And there are distributors that do that in an informal way, but I mean, how about, customers who bought this also bought that? That's a core part of what's on Amazon. And I would argue that customers see that as a service because they're not forgetting things. And many distributors could do much better with that than they're doing today.
Definitely a growth opportunity.
You need to be able to connect to marketplaces. I mean, look, you got to have a marketplace strategy. I'm not necessarily suggesting that you sell an Amazon business or on Amazon. I don't know if you saw this, but the Wall Street Journal last week did an investigative story in which they claim that Amazon is using third-party seller data to introduce competing private label SKUs. Now, that may not sound shocking other than the fact that Amazon's general counsel told Congress definitively that they weren't doing that. So learning how to sell services, whether it's, bundled steel like this, or it's, one of the many others that we've talked about, the kitting and labeling and assembly and rentals and repairs, all the other stuff. Not only do you need to learn how to sell that, but I think to your point, Jonathan, you need to learn how to deliver that online. I mean, how do I request or, set up a repair online, or how do I order kitting and labeling or cable assembly or whatever through a website? I mean, people are used to getting services that way. And look, there are entire industries that are services that are set up online. I mean, when you rent through Airbnb or buy an airline ticket, I mean, those are services, and there's a lot of configuration in there. So there's no reason that distributors can't set up their websites for configuring services, other than we just don't have experience at it. We're used to, a SKU and a price and the quantity. And last, you have to incorporate emerging technologies. I mean, I've written and talked a lot about artificial intelligence, and just as a shout out, Jonathan and I are writing a series of 7 white papers, and there are going to be 7 accompanying webinars. And this is being produced and sponsored by the NAW, the National Association of Wholesaler Distributors. So that's the first one's going to drop in July. There's going to be substantial, heavily researched, and very rigorously reviewed and edited papers with some webcasts to follow them. There's 7 of them. It's going to add up to a lot of material. And the idea is to look at all these emerging technologies, not just AI, but also blockchain and additive manufacturing, et cetera. So it's going to be, the notion is, the aspiration is to make this the definitive series on how technology is transforming wholesale distribution, and we're thrilled to be working with them. So if you don't subscribe to NAW Smart Brief, you should, because a lot of that material is going to be announced there. You can also go to distributionstrategy.com, and we'll be sending alerts so you can subscribe through us as well. But this is a big deal for us. We're already working on it, and we're very excited. We're expecting a very, very large audience for this material, and we're going to explore every one of these technologies in depth and talk about just how it's going to affect distributors and what distributors should do about it, because of how customer expectations are going to change as they get more comfortable with these technologies.
So there's a question or a comment on the chat. Ron Paulson says, what will the talent management requirements / profiles of employees and customers look like in the new marketplace? What gaps do you see?
Yeah, so hi, Ron, longtime friend, great to hear from you. So I would say that for distributors, you're competing in an era where technology is going to become increasingly important. I mean, think about, two of the companies I've mentioned that are building marketplaces are Google, arguably one of the leading technology companies in the world, and Amazon.
That's actually inarguable.
That is inarguable, right? Fair enough. And Amazon, guess what? Also inarguable, one of the leading technology companies in the world, and they're both building marketplaces, and they're selling products from distributors today. That's the competitive set. So if you, by comparison, don't have anyone on your team who's very literate with AI, for example, then how are you going to build out those capabilities as customers come to expect them? Because I think for the next 5 years, you can get away with, not having voice ordering and item recognition ordering that's built into glasses or whatever, but you're not going to get away with it for 10 years. And so you better have your IT department up to speed with people who are immersed in these emerging technologies and can make them come to life in a very practical way through state-of-the-art systems. I mean, if you don't have a state-of-the-art ERP, you need to start there because that's the foundational system, but there are many others that you should be investing in. It's just going to be a requirement going forward. I think that's part of the requirement. I think some of the stuff we've talked about being literate at working from home and remotely on remote teams, that's going to become increasingly important. I was telling Jonathan earlier, I said, you go to a distribution conference and a lot of them still, people are dressed in business attire. A lot of people are in ties. If you go to a VC conference or a technology conference in Silicon Valley, man, there's people out there in jeans and tracksuits and everything else. And the reality is that distribution over time, and apparel is just a proxy for how the times are changing because we've gotten more casual over time. Distribution needs to care less about things like how people dress and whether or not they come into the office, because if you want the very, very best talent, then you need to stop putting barriers in people's way. And I think it's just time for us to modernize and make a bigger tent for people to come into distribution because it's an exciting cutting edge industry. And that's going to wind up with a more diverse talent pool, by the way, and it's going to wind up with a younger group of employees than you typically see in a distribution environment. So I think that, if you want the best of the best, you have to change the profile of who you're recruiting, and you have to change the environment in which you're going to ask them to work.
I think in addition to the tech aspect of who you're recruiting and the environment into which you are placing them, maybe, Ron, at the heart of your question is what do skill sets look like? And the whole death of a B2B salesman, I think, was a good article. And one of the things that it pointed out is that the reps that are providing a consultative benefit, that are adding value, those are going to be a growing portion. Those who are closer to order taker are going to be a shrinking portion of the B2B professional sales pool. So I think more broadly, the business is going to need to understand value in a way that it has probably never understood value before. To the extent that marketplaces get lift, they're going to further commoditize a lot of what is sold. And as Ian was pointing out, that's going to place even more leverage or pressure on understanding value and being able to sell value. So I think that's a big transformation for a lot of distribution field sales force organizations.
Yeah, we have another question or comment. Technical support and advice is nice and sticky too. I certainly agree with that. I think that's absolutely right. I would just caution that that's not going to be an advantage forever. I have a job posting that Amazon had for a machine data scientist, and they said, our vision for Alexa is to become the most knowledgeable resource that knows everything about every product ever made attached to a store that sells everything. Well, it's going to be a long time before Alexa or any other digital assistant replaces technical experts, but that Alexa is going to continue to eat into answering more and more questions that are less and less basic over time. So I think that I absolutely agree with that statement. You've got to have knowledgeable employees, and I've seen it as a very powerful differentiator. At the same time, it's probably not going to last forever, and it'll probably get a little weaker over time. And then there was a question, how can manufacturers support distributors going forward with this accelerated shift to digital. Do you want to comment on that first, Jonathan?
For just the most, at the simplest level, blocking and tackling is making sure that manufacturers are providing good data in the shift to digital. I think a second piece in support that's more proactive is going to be tying MDF to digital maturity and digital capability. I think a third piece, I would say going beyond support, is almost demanding the shift to digital, that you're starting to select your channel partners based on their digital capabilities. So I think having a clear understanding of what the key digital capabilities are is important in making that selection.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, we know of a manufacturer who has set out detailed digital requirements, and they audit their distributors and say, you have to have these, you have to perform to this standard if you want to continue to earn our business. Now, some manufacturers have more influence in the channel than others, but at the very least, I think, to set out a series of expectations and say, look, this is the performance that we believe a world-class distributor has. That's very useful to a distributor. And some distributors would benefit by you saying, look, we sell to all kinds of distributors. Here's what the successful ones in digital are doing. I mean, you're not disclosing any trade secrets, just saying these are in general the kinds of tools and capabilities they have. I think that's perfectly fair. And when I was a VP of marketing for distributors, I would have appreciated that input. And I think, at some point in time, it does become a set of requirements, because it's going to be important for you to maintain share that you have distributors who are digitally competent. All right, I don't see any more questions, so I think we can probably wrap this up now. Is that right? You have anything else you want to summarize with, Jonathan?
Just excited for the next call.
Yeah, me too. We're going to do this on a regular basis. We're calling the show Wholesale Change. You will see it as a webcast and then distributed as a podcast later. So thank you so much for attending our inaugural webcast. Feel free to reach out to Jonathan or me. You can find our contact information on distributionstrategy.com. Jonathan, thanks so much. It was great talking with you today. And Jason, thank you very much for producing the episode for us. You guys, everyone have a wonderful day. Stay safe and try to stay as healthy as you can in this crazy environment, and have a wonderful rest of the week.
I would add one final thing. You should make sure to maintain at least 6 feet distance from yourself at all points in time in this environment.
Yeah, and someone asked, sorry, Jonathan, someone asked if we're going to provide a copy of the recording later, and the answer is yes. We will reach out to you with a link to get that. Sorry, Jonathan.
No, we're good.
All right, thanks everyone. Have a wonderful day.